to drink this. It's going to be tricky. Anyway, L'chaim, gentlemen. Take two. Where were we? Well, until the revelation of the Kabbalah, until the Kabbalah became the normative theology of Judaism, as it is today, if you went and learned from the Jewish philosophers, if you went to learn from the Rambam, for example, the Rambam does not say that God is in everything. The Rambam says that there's God, and then there's the creations. And the two things are not the same thing. God is not in everything. The creation is not created as a piece of God or with God in it or anything like that. The creation is the creation. It's a separate thing from Hashem. It's created something from nothing. It's created at a distance from Hashem. It's created as a separate thing from godliness. That's what you would have found there. There's God, and then there's the creation. And the Rambam is very strict about this. In other words, even things you would think maybe are not a creation, the Rambam would say are actually a creation. What sort of things would you think are not a creation? That brings us to our next point. In last week's Parsha, when you read about God's creation of the world, you find a very, very interesting thing. It says God creates the light. How does God create the light? Very famously, God says, "Let there be light," and there is light. Now, what's interesting is that it could have said anything, right? And let me explain to you what I mean by anything, right? The Torah could have said that God created the light as some kind of part of Him. The Torah very could have easily said that, right? The Torah could have said God took a part off of Himself, right? Or as some lahavdil elef alfei avdalos, as some mythologies and things like that say, the world is an excretion of some kind from God, right? It's like God produces it in one way or another, right? It comes from within His body. We could have said, why is that impossible?
Because God has no parts.
But He can talk. 1 second. Let's not be judging or so fast what's impossible, right? It's not impossible. It's not more impossible than God speaking. Why should that be any more impossible? God has a mouth. There's air. Where's this air coming? That's in God's vocal cords that He's speaking out, right? It could have said, instead of God speaking, it could have said God excreted the world, or God gave birth to the world. Maybe it would be a good metaphor, right? It's one way you could say it. It could say God planted the world and it grew as a garden. There's a million things it could have said.
Emanated.
Right? It could have also said, on the other hand, because I understand Eyal's immediate revulsion to such a concept, because such things make God sound like he has a body, or the form of a body. It makes us sound like idolaters, God forbid, lahavdil, to say that God has a body, right? So what it could have said, on the other hand, if the Torah wanted to be very not mistakable for idolatry, it could have just said, Elokim bara et ha'or. God created the light. And of course, as we know from the Ramban's famous commentary on the word bara, the word create, that the word bara refers to creating yesh ma'ayin, is what it refers to. When we say create, that's what Barry's Hebrew school teacher told him, that people only make, only God creates. That's because creation means that word in Hebrew means something from nothing. So the Torah could have said that God barad, He was the Beirei, was the creator of the light. If the Torah had described that, the Torah would have described God not having to use a process to create. Exactly as we discussed previously. God can create something from nothing. God does not need a process. God, in fact, does bring the universe into being from something into nothing. So why doesn't the verse use the verb, use the action of bringing into being something from nothing? The verse could say God brought it into being as if from nothing, right? Or from nothing, really, not even as if. He brought it into being from nothing. In other words, without a process. There's no process. There's no giving birth to the world. There's no ingredients to the world. There's nothing involving anything like God's body to the world. He just created it. It wasn't here, and now it's here, right? It's like something from nothing is like magic, except magic is real. Poof, it's here. Presto, it's here, right? There's nothing to say. There is nothing, now there's something. And there is no process. The Torah could have said that just as easily. It could have said Hashem bara et ha'or. So the Torah could have said anything. It could have said much more bodily examples, much more physical examples. It could have said examples that totally negated any divine body. It could have said Hashem created, poof. Instead it says He said, let there be light, and there was light. This raises an immediate issue to the worldview which says there is only God and the creation. Which is why the Torah says it, if you follow the perspective of Kabbalah, which everyone does today. Even those who think they don't do. But that's a separate issue.
Even if we think that way, there are certain things which are made without process, and other things which are...
No, I'm not denying that. That's a separate issue. You're right. There are some things that are Yesh Ma'ayin.
No, but that's exactly what I'm talking about. Like
Okay.
God created the earth at first,
Yeah.
and then out of the earth He made man.
Right.
He actually took material that He already created, and
Yes.
from that He created
Yes, correct.
So, I mean, there could be...
Very good.
There's processes.
Very good. That sounds like a process to me, absolutely. So, absolutely, I agree with you. So, the question is where did the earth come from? Right, that's the question. That's like the famous story with the there's a very proud the famous story is there's a very proud silversmith or something like that. There's a very proud craftsman, and he passes away and he goes up to heaven after 120 years, and God asks him, what can you do? Why are you so proud, such a proud person? And the craftsman said, I'm such a proud person because I can make these most incredible and the most beautiful things. And God says, well, show me what you can make. And the silversmith takes like 1,000,000 years, because there's no time in the same way in the afterlife. And he builds a whole planet out of silver, the most incredible thing. And he says, look, this is the sort of thing I could do. God says, it's very impressive, but next time use your own silver. Right. Classic stories. Next time use your own silver. In other words, yeah, if there's man may be created from the earth, but the question is, where does the earth come from? Anyway, the question is, when the Torah talks about the creation of the light, right, and it says, God says, let there be light, this implies that now there is not two things. There's not God and His creation. There is God, His creation, and, critically, something in between. That is God in the process of creating. When God says, let there be light, the words God is speaking is not God, because before that God wasn't speaking, whatever we mean by before that, it's a separate issue. But before that God wasn't speaking, right? It's not the result. The result is something called light. There's something in the middle where God says, let there be light. What is this? If you don't have the Kabbalah, if you went and you studied the philosophy of the Rambam says everything that you think is not a creation is just a higher creation. In other words, let there be light is some form of creation. It itself is the words let there be light is itself a creation. That creation is then what went on to produce the light. Almost in the way Al was saying that the earth is used in the creation of man, the dust, right, is used in the creation of man, right, or any other creating something from something. There's a creation. That creation then goes on to do another creation. That's how you read this non-Kabbalistically. The issue is that it's very strange. That's the issue. The issue is that although there are good theological and philosophical reasons to want to read the Torah this way, which is why, of course, God forbid, the Rambam was not being frivolous to read the Torah this way. On the contrary, there's very good reasons to read the Torah this way. Nevertheless, in the pashut pshat of the Torah, the way a child would read it, makes no sense whatsoever. No sense whatsoever. God's speaking is itself a creation that then makes another creation. If I come to you and I say, listen, you have God. God says, let there be a fish, right? And then the fish is brought into being through his saying, let there be a fish. Which one is closer to him, the fish or him saying, let there be a fish?
Right, theoretically.
Obviously, him saying, let there be a fish is closer to him. The fish is the result, right? The process is saying, let there be a fish.
But if it's
Right, that's clearly, one second, that's clearly what the Torah seems to be discussing. The Torah clearly seems to be discussing a process of creation. There's a result, there's God, there's a process that goes in between, right? This thing, this act of speaking, this process is what is called Shem Elokim. Shem Elokim in Kabbalah is something that without Kabbalah did not exist. It's a little counterintuitive because it's the lower name, as we'll see when we keep learning, right? God in the act of speaking, God in the act of creating, that the speech of God is actually a process that is part of creation, right? That speech of God is that process described by the speaking is what we call Shem Elokim. There is a process. As Eyal says, there's something from nothing and a process. That's what's as we're gonna go further, we're gonna see. It's both. There's both. There's something from nothing and there's a process. But which one is the bigger innovation? In other words, which one is the secret? Which one is the one that was hidden in Kabbalah? Is the process, not the something from nothing. The something from nothing was always known. The Kabbalah comes and tells us the process. Now the thing is, if God does not need to create with a process, why is he creating with a process? And the answer is, in short, which we actually already said it last week, this is all just a preface to getting back to what we were discussing last week. As we were discussing last week, the name Elohim, when God speaks, it's a concealment of God. And that's what we ended last week's class with. I'm just checking the time, pardon me. That's what we ended last week's class with. We ended last week's class by saying the name of Elohim, which we now understand much better what it is. It's the process that goes into the creation. It's God speaking when God didn't need to speak. God could have just made everything come into being, something from nothing. That process is a process whereby Hashem is concealed. Or in other words, if God had not spoken, God would not be as concealed as he is now. If God had created directly, if it was just Hashem bara es ha'er, God would not be as hidden as he is now. And that is why he spoke. Even though he didn't need to, even though he could bring everything into being just as it is, why did he speak? He spoke in order to conceal himself.
But in that case, you need to explain what is Vayomer. It's like what it sounds when he spoke.
So that's the next, very good. That's exactly the next thing.
Just a alliteration.
What?
God speaks. God.
Metaphorically, right? A metaphor for what? Yeah.
It's just a way for human beings to understand.
That's what the Rambam would tell you. The Rambam would tell you that when it says God speaks, there's nothing actually like God speaking. It's just that to make things easier for the human ear. The question is again on the Rambam, and there's good reason to say that again. We're not trifling, God forbid, with what the Rambam says. But the question is a metaphor for what? What is this making so easy for the human ear to understand that God speaks things in? Who speaks things into being? That's easier to understand than saying He brought into being something from nothing. I never saw someone speak something into being before.
Every magician say,
So the way I see it,
Yeah.
when you say something, you utter it and then it's gone.
Yeah.
So in order to sustain the thing to exist, you have to say it all the time.
Right, as we learn.
So that's why
God is constantly speaking.
Even
That is not why we use it. Maybe that's one reason why we use a metaphor.
metaphor anyway, because just to take Eyal's engineering relationship, let there be light, let there be light, there's a break. There is a gap between each
Not
other.
when time is not an issue. Not when you're your own time.
No. If God is constantly recreating the world, but constantly saying the words, there has got to be a gap in each phrase, which means that there's a point in time. So it's all a metaphor in that sense.
But why did he have to use the word Vayomer? He could have done some other thing. Say,
Absolutely.
He could have said, move his finger, and there was light.
It could have said he threw stones, like
Yes.
the Midrash
But
says.
first he had to create the stones.
No, the Midrash says he threw the stones in order to create the world. No, you're wondering what were the stones, right? It's a different mimer for a different day.
No, I mean, the verse Vayomer has a meaning over here.
Of course it does. Of course it
As
does.
a purpose, maybe.
Absolutely. Why is it called speech? That's exactly the question.
Nachus.
And the answer is the reason it's called speech is because speech has a very, very precise nature among all the faculties of the soul. And we've discussed it in this class before, but I'll remind you, and we'll discuss it more next week, God willing. Speech has a very precise nature. Thinking, you have thought, speech, and action, are known as the three garments of the soul, which really just means these are three things that the soul does rather than what the soul is. It's really what it means, that they're garments of the soul. You have three things the soul does. You have thought, speech, and action. Well, the first thing it tells you is that the universe is something that God does, not something that God is, right? That's the first thing it tells you. Since it's only speech, right? It doesn't say God seicheled the world into being, or God midas the world into being. It doesn't say God intellected the world into being, or God emoted the world into being, as you would say in English, right? So automatically, because it is not talking about God's core personality, the world, you already know, is not something that God immutably is. The world is something that God does. World is as world does. God is as God does. No, that's not true. I was just quoting the movie. The world is not something that God is. It's something that God does. But there's three types of things that a soul does, that a person does in the deepest meaning of the word person. There's three things you can do. There's thought, speech, and action. Thought is something that you do only within yourself, that cannot be revealed to another person. Speech is what you do that is for the purpose of revelation to others. And action is something that the soul expresses itself where even the words that it uses are other than itself. It's an expression in the language or through the medium of something other than oneself, right? Like when I move this cup, the motion is not really even in me, the motion is in the cup, right? Or when I move my arm even, right? Even my arm in the sense that I'm moving it is not myself, right? It's an object that I move, etc., etc. It's something that I'm moving. It's not soul stuff that's moving, it's body stuff that's moving, right? That's the idea. Anyway, so you have thought, speech, and action. You have thought, which is doing only within myself. There is action, which is doing where the thing that actually has been done is separate from me. And then you have a middle thing, which is called speech, which is someone does something for expression outward, right? But what is it that's actually coming out? It's them themselves, right? Unlike the action, right? In the action, what comes out in my action is not me. Action is the manipulation of the world outside of me. That's really what action is. When I speak, my voice is an actual expression of my soul. So you have a voice, you're hearing my voice, you're hearing my soul speak itself out to you, right? For expression to others, right? When we say God speaks to create the world then, what we mean very precisely, is that God is doing an action when he creates the world. On the one hand, it's not thought. It's not thought, because if it was thought, there is no concept of the receiver, of the other in this act. There's no concept of the zulas, as we would say in Chassidus. There's no concept of the recipient. Thinking is totally within oneself. Right? If God thought the world into being, that would be a metaphor for expressing only within himself and to himself. There is no other here. If we said an action, right, that God, if like the famous metaphor right, that the Torah could have said of God throwing the stones, for example, or any other action of God creating the world, right, what would that imply? It would imply that the world becomes separate from God. It becomes an action in a totally separate place. It's the middle. It's speech. On the one hand, the world is created to another. On the other hand, what is it communicating? It's communicating God, just as speech communicates the soul. That's why speech is chosen. You have the middle. It's the middle of all the actions that God could do. If God is making a world and the world is not God, God forbid, which we know it's not, right? Then there's three types of ways he could have created it. He could have created it with thought, in which case it would be purely expression to himself. There would be no other. There would be no one that God was talking to, so to speak. If it was through action, then it would just be something that totally separated from him. It would be action at a total distance from Hashem. There's a middle road, which is speech. God speaks the world into being. The process of speech is God is expressing himself, but how is he expressing himself? In a way that the other can receive it. Yes?
Very, very strange, because at that time, there was nobody to hear.
Ah, very good. That's exactly my next point. Eyal, you're helping me out in this class.
May I say something?
That's a whole other mystery. Yes, please do.
In Shabbat, for instance,
Yeah.
when there is Aliyat Olamot, he thinks the world to existence. And this is actually a taste of Mashiach, that's true. So he can actually think and influence the world without Vaydaber, without talking. Sorry.
What is the same Torah that
God does all of these things in connection to the world. We only know what exists in this mimer. That's all we know that exists.
No, it just,
I understand 100%. I'm not denying it. God does think, and God wills, and God acts. There's all sorts of things. There's all sorts of metaphors, and each thing has to be understood in its place. Right now we're talking about the primary act of creation described in the first chapter of Bereshis, which is the act of speech. So again, speech, expression of the self to the other. Now, this explains the question that we had at the end of last week's class. The question at the end of last week's class was, we read that Shem Elokim conceals Shem Havaya, which means God's speech conceals whatever God was before he spoke. It covers it over, it hides it. Right? Now we can return to this question and understand it in a much more profound way. What does it mean that God's speech conceals what God is before he speaks? Right? Given what we understand about speech, how we've just defined speech, which is the self-revelation to the other, and Eyal asks, but there was no other there yet. Keep that in mind. How it's the self-revelation to the other, right? So what does it mean that the speech conceals the person? It means, well, there's two aspects of speech, right? Let's break down speech. Speech is two things. It's self-revelation. That's what makes it not action. Action is totally in the realm of the other, right? Speech is self-revelation, right? But to whom? To the other, right? Which one of these constitutes the concealment of God? You have self-revelation to the other.
the other.
So it's the fact that it's to the other. Speech has two aspects. On the one hand, speech reveals, but on the other hand, in the very act of revealing, speech also conceals. Why? Why? Oh, how much time do we have? It's the real philosophical question. None, basically. Okay, we're going to end the class with the same question as last week, but I'm hoping that it's a much better question this week. And the question is, what does it mean that speech conceals God rather than reveals him? Speech seems to be revelation, but speech, we learned in our mimer, Elokim conceals Havaya, which means God's active speech conceals what God was before he spoke. God willing, next week, without any further ado, we're going to actually answer this question and, God willing, move forward in this mimer. I hope everyone enjoyed the class. This is the correct pace to learn a mimer of the Rebbe Rashab. You really have to get in there. Anyway, l'chaim to everyone. Have a good week.
It's also